Welcome to the Book of Kings. You excited? Kings picks up where Samuel left off, following Israel's monarchy after Saul and David, and now starts with Solomon, and it's going to go down to the exile, covering 400 years of history. And while it covers a lot of history, the Book of Kings is not a history book. It's not here simply to dispense facts, to give dates. No, what is the Book of Kings? Kings is a prophetic reflection on the monarchy from the perspective of the exile. It's written during the exile to an exilic audience. Now, take a look at some of these exiles I have here in the corner. They are in Babylon, that's a Babylonian ziggurat, and they're talking amongst themselves. And their hearts are broken, they're shedding some tears, and they're asking each other, why the exile? Why the exile? Is there any hope for Jerusalem, for the Davidic covenant? And while they're having this conversation, Grandpa Prophet is sitting in his rocking chair. This is Grandpa. Grandpa Prophet is sitting in his rocking chair in the corner, and he hears them. He says, gather round, gather round. I just wrote a book, 1st and 2nd Kings, and it's designed to answer that very question. Yes, there is hope, but Kings is primarily written as an assessment of the monarchy of Israel, a nation which God entered into covenant with for them to be a kingdom of priests, and through their obedience to the Torah, a light to all nations. But Israel broke that covenant. They became just like all the nations that were around them, and therefore God, who was faithful to the covenant, he executed the covenant curses upon Israel and Judah, and they were sent into exile. And that's the story that Grandpa Prophet is going to tell the exiles, primarily. So how does he do that? What is the structure of the Book of Kings? Kings is going to begin with the reign of Solomon in 1 Kings 1 to 11. It's going to look at his ascent to the throne in chapters 1 and 2, and then chapters 3 through 10 are going to deal with the rise of Solomon, and everything's wonderful. It deals with his wisdom, the wealth of his kingdom, his building of the temple, but then he marries foreign wives who introduce foreign worship into Israel. Solomon is sucked into idolatry, and we have Solomon's fall moment here, which results in the kingdom, his glorious kingdom, being ripped in two. And that division of the kingdom is what is covered here in the second section of 1st and 2nd Kings, starting in 1 Kings 12 and going to 2 Kings 17. It's going to follow two parallel stories, the story of Israel and the story of Judah. And it's going to watch the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah, the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah, kings of Israel, kings of Judah, until Israel's destruction by Assyria and their exile in 2 Kings 17. But interrupting this long narrative, we have the account of two prophets, Elijah and Elisha, and their story depicts a confrontation, Yahweh's confrontation with the dynasty of Ahab and Ahab's introduction of the worship of Baal into Israel. Important chapters dealt with here in the middle. So then after the exile to Assyria, the remainder of the book of 2 Kings 18 to 25, is going to cover Judah alone among the nations. And we're going to have a couple of good kings here in Judah. Hezekiah is a good guy, and Josiah is amazing. Josiah here in chapters 22 and 23, but in between these two great kings, we have Manasseh, who happens to be the worst king ever, and then Israel's monarchy is going to end with 4 terrible kings who do what is evil in the sight of the Lord, resulting in the destruction of Jerusalem, the burning and ransacking of the temple, and the exile to Babylon. Pretty sad story, Mr. Grandpa Prophet. Really, is that where you're going to end us? Well, no. Fortunately, Grandpa Prophet has some mercy, and he's going to finish the book with a glimmer of hope. The glimmer of hope, which jumps decades into the future and depicts a son of David who is exalted while in Babylon. So this is the structure of the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, and they cover a lot of history. They cover 400 years of history and 40 kings. 20 kings of Israel and 20 kings of Judah, and it's really complicated and it's intimidating, and there's a lot of names and there's a lot of dates, and it's tough, and I get it. And one thing that I have found personally helpful, kind of when I approach anything that's big and complicated and confusing, is to take that big, complicated, and confusing subject and to break it down into small pieces. So we have 400 years and 40 kings, and I found in my studies that I could break that period down. First off, the first section being Israel and Judah, the divided kingdom, and then we have Judah alone. You got roughly 200 years here and kind of roughly 150 years there with Judah alone. And this section here, I found that you can divide it into about 4 different sections, and each of those sections conveniently has 5 kings of Israel in each of these sections. And then this section with Judah only, I found it convenient to divide it into 3 separate sections. And we'll explain what each of these sections mean very soon, but just to kind of explain the process. Here in each one of these sections, you can imagine it kind of like a box. And you have a whole bunch of facts and data and history and people that are going to go into this box. And what's going to come out is just one main idea. What's the main idea of each of these sections? And I've given you a handout. It's called 1st and 2nd Kings Historical Overview. And it gives you the main idea of each of these sections. And that's what we're going to turn to next. All right, guys, time for that historical survey I promised you. This is a document which I prepared for you as my attempt to simplify a whole bunch of history into bite-sized pieces. We have here on the left the kings of Judah, and on the right the kings of Israel. There's 20 of each. The kings of Judah that are good are going to be blue in color. The bad ones are red. And then the alternating colors are just alternating dynasties within Israel. And like I said, I think it's convenient to divide the divided kingdom, the period where Israel and Judah are existing alongside one another, into 4 different sections. The early kings of Israel, the house of Omri, and his sons, and then the house of Jehu and his sons, 5 kings, and then the final kings of Israel, the late kings of Israel. And you can see here in this document that I've kind of given you some kind of main ideas of each section. Now, let me just kind of survey those quickly. I know you can read, but let me just give you my 2 cents. So I would think the main idea of this first section of Israel's history during the early kings of Israel is just civil war. It's conflict between Israel and Judah. Now let me show that to you guys through a couple of verses. Let's see, 1 Kings 14:30. And this is just going to depict, again, conflict between Israel and Judah. Conflict between Israel and Judah. There was war between Rehoboam, king of Judah, and Jeroboam continually. Down to 15:6, same thing. There was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all the days of his life. 15:7, and there was war between Abijam, this is king of Judah, and Jeroboam. Let's go down to verse 16, and there was war between Asa, king of Judah, and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days. Same thing here in verse 32. Here it is, and there was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days. So, main idea then of this first section is conflict between Israel and Judah. And this conflict is actually going to kind of enter a standstill, interestingly enough, when Asa, king of Judah, is going to appeal for help from the king of Syria. Here's a little map for you. So Judah is here in the south, Israel's here in the middle in green, and then Aram is another word for Syria. And Asa, king of Judah, is going to say, hey, Aram, help me out against the Israelites. And Syria is going to be like, I would love to oblige. Give me all your money. And then Syria comes down and wages war against Israel and takes some of the pressure off of Judah. And interestingly enough, this historical circumstance is going to result in conflict between Israel and Syria for the rest of Israel's history. So I do think that's an important element to consider here under the first box. So now, second box, the dynasty of Omri. What's interesting about this section, it's a very prosperous section, certainly for Israel. And it's made that way partly because Omri makes peace with Judah. You're going to see several times in this section the kings of Judah, like Jehoshaphat, are going to help out and support the kings of Israel, Ahab, in battle and war against Syria and then also against Moab as well. And they make a marriage alliance between the two houses. But let me ask you, is this a good thing, this alliance between Israel and Judah, or is this a bad thing? Well, I think that it's not as good as you may think. So take a look here at 2 Kings 8:18. We have, unfortunately, Jehoram, king of Judah, is going to walk in the ways of the king of Israel. Now, Jehoram was an ally of Israel at this time, and that probably was the reason he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. And go down to verse 27, the next king of Judah, Ahaziah, verse 27, he also walked in the house of Ahab and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So spiritually, not a good thing during this period. Next section, the kings of Jehu. This is a section that's characterized by prosperity and peace for kind of both sides, really. And the conflict between Israel and Syria is going to experience a lot of losses initially. That they're going to be defeated by Syria until one of their great generals, Hazael, is going to die, and then after that, Israel is going to experience victories. And I think a lot of this prosperity is also due to the fact that Assyria was very weak during this time and wasn't really interfering in the international scene. Now, this last section is going to chronicle the rise of Assyria and Israel's revolt against Assyria, and then their resulting exile. So first, Tiglath-Pileser III, a king of Assyria, is going to get tribute from king of Israel, Menahem, and they're going to shrink their territory. They're going to actually end up wiping out Syria. And then a decade later, Shalmaneser IV is going to destroy and exile Israel. Now that brings us to an overview of the period. Let me get this bigger for you guys. Zoom in. I know that's really small, wasn't it? That brings us to the period of Judah alone. And I think you can divide this section into three different parts. The first part, just cataloging Judah's shifting loyalty with Assyria. So sometimes they're a vassal to Assyria, sometimes they rebel against Assyria. So initially, Ahaz wasn't a vassal, but then following the Syro-Ephraimite War, they become a vassal. Now, very briefly, Israel, during this war, Israel and Syria ally together, and they try to get Judah to join their alliance against Assyria. But instead of joining that alliance, Judah says, hey, Assyria, you want to help me out against these two neighbors of mine? Assyria says, sure. Oh, by the way, I want all your taxes. So that kind of happened there, and as a result, Ahaz became a vassal to Assyria. Hezekiah is going to rebel against the vassalship, but it's going to result in the destruction of 46 of his fortified cities. Judah is going to be surrounded and besieged, and they're only going to escape this siege by the miraculous intervention of God in the destruction of 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. After that, Manasseh is just a faithful vassal to Assyria, so is Amnon, and that brings in kind of the next phase of international history, which I call the fall of Assyria, because there are a series of campaigns where Babylon is on the rise and Assyria is going down. Let me show you a fun little picture of that. Next picture. Here is the extent of the Assyrian Empire, and now we have the destruction of Syria, where Babylon first is going to claim their home capital in Babylon, and then they're going to make Assur fall, and they're going to go up and destroy Nineveh, and they're going to force the Assyrians to flee to the northwest, and then finally they're going to be destroyed at Carchemish, and that's kind of the death blow for Syria, and that's going to introduce the dominance of Babylon in this final section with the final handful of kings of Judah. And in this section we see three different deportations. The first deportation, Daniel is taken to Babylon, and then after that Jehoiachin and his family and Ezekiel is taken in 597, and then finally in 586 Zedekiah and the rest of the people are taken into Babylon. And that's how the book of Kings ends, and of course there is that glimmer of hope, but we're going to take a look at the main themes of 1st and 2nd Kings in our next lecture.